I woke to the guttural roar of chainsaws, not the faint buzz of a neighbor pruning hedges, but a deep, primal snarl that yanked me from sleep, my stomach dropping as I bolted upright, groggy mind scrambling to make sense of it. Through the window, reality slammed into me like a fist. Men in neon vests swarmed my backyard, chainsaws slashing through my orchard like it was a nuisance to be cleared. A towering apple tree, 50 years old and rooted in my family's land, groaned and crashed in a spray of splintered branches and smashed fruit. And I tore downstairs, flung open the back door, and sprinted into the chaos, heart hammering as sawdust stung my eyes. There, amid the carnage, stood Karen, HOA queen, arms crossed, smirking like she'd just won a war. "Oh, good, you're awake," she said, unflinching as another tree toppled, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, the stench of fresh-cut wood and crushed apples choking me as my award-winning orchard, decades of history, was hacked apart. She added, "You're welcome," as if she'd done me a favor, not gutted my soul. "Now your yard won't be such an eyesore." It hadn't always been like this. When I moved in, I thought I'd found peace, a quiet retirement spot with a big yard to nurture my family's legacy, trees planted by my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, each one a living monument. Apples that won state fairs, peaches featured in magazines, cherries prized by chefs. This wasn't just land. It was my life, my childhood summers picking fruit, my dad's proud grin at every harvest. But Karen saw it differently, starting the day she knocked on my door, clipboard in hand, fake smile stretched tight. "Welcome to the neighborhood, just a few HOA rules to go over," her eyes glinting as she scanned my yard like a conqueror sizing up territory. I should have seen it then, the way she didn't see a home but a project to bend to her will. At first, it was petty. My rustic fence, my garden gnomes, my uncohesive mailbox, annoying but ignorable, and I brushed her off, thinking she'd tire out. Then the letters started, anonymous but obviously hers, typed in that HOA jargon she hid behind. My yard was overgrown. My trees clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. And I ignored them, too busy with real life to entertain her mailbox color obsession. But Karen didn't like being ignored. She'd show up unannounced, snapping photos, making notes, griping to anyone listening about my orchard ruining the community harmony. And I'd still shrug, letting her stew. Then the fines hit. $50 for non-regulation plant life, $100 for excessive foliage. Laughable at first, until they piled up, relentless as her smirk. One day, I caught her scowling at my favorite apple tree, a massive beauty older than me, dripping with ruby fruit, and she snapped. "That tree's an eyesore," so I grinned. "It's older than this HOA," and jokingly named it Old Karen. Word spread, neighbors laughed, she didn't, and I never thought she'd escalate to this, never imagined she'd bring chainsaws to my legacy. Now, standing in my ruined yard, I shouted, "You had no right," as she waved a paper like a trophy. "Oh, but I did. Section 5B says landscaping disrupting visual cohesion can be removed." And I snarled, "That's not what it says," rage shaking my voice. She shrugged. "The HOA board voted, and since I run it." It hit me then. She'd rigged some sham vote, twisted the rules to justify this madness, and as the last tree fell, I knew she'd crossed a line she'd regret. The chainsaws fell silent, leaving an eerie stillness in my backyard, the air thick with the scent of shredded wood and the sour tang of crushed fruit. And I stood there, fists clenched, staring at the wreckage, stumps where my family's trees once towered, broken branches and smashed apples littering the ground like a battlefield after a rout. Karen still smirked, arms crossed, basking in her twisted triumph as if she'd just tidied up a mess instead of obliterating my orchard, my legacy. And I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the fury down because losing it wouldn't bring my trees back. I wasn't about to let her see me crack, not when I could already feel a plan forming behind the red haze in my mind. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," I said, my voice low and steady, and she rolled her eyes, waving that HOA paper like it was holy writ. "Oh, please, you were warned. Your little forest was ruining the uniform aesthetic. Now it's clean and proper." I let out a sharp laugh, shaking my head. "You don't even realize what you've done, do you?" Her frown flickered, unsure why I wasn't crumbling like she'd expected, and she snapped. "I saved property values from your ridiculous farming experiment. It's just a bunch of trees." My jaw tightened. Just a bunch of trees. Those were my history, my grandfather's cherry tree that survived storms and fire, My father's apple tree planted the day I was born, my peach tree with 3 state fair ribbons, all reduced to sawdust in a morning because she couldn't stand anything she didn't control. Before I could fire back, a worker approached, looking sheepish. "Sir, we were just following HOA orders. We were told it was approved." And I swung my gaze to Karen. "You signed off on it personally, didn't you?" Her smirk widened. "Of course, as president, it's my job to ensure compliance, and trust me, Joe, you were never going to comply." I studied her, that smug certainty radiating off her, thinking she'd won, thinking I'd slink away defeated, but she had no clue what was brewing. I pulled out my phone, snapped photos of the devastation, and said, "Hope you have a good lawyer," watching her scoff. "Don't be dramatic. You signed the HOA agreement. This is legal." I smiled, no warmth in it. "Karen, you just destroyed an orchard under evaluation for historical preservation. Those weren't just trees. They were part of a state-recognized agricultural heritage program." Her smug mask slipped for a heartbeat before she rallied. "You're making that up." But I shook my head. "Submitted the paperwork months ago, that cherry tree? Oldest documented lineage in the region, those apples, rarest heirlooms left, the peaches, worth a fortune, and you had no legal right to touch them without a hearing." She huffed, clinging to her authority. "The board voted." But I cut in, stepping closer. "I'll be requesting those meeting minutes. Let's see how official it was." And for the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. She opened her mouth, then shut it, scrambling for a defense I didn't let her find. "Get ready for a lawsuit," I said. "Destruction of property, trespassing, vandalism, financial damages. The value of those trees is going to bury you." And as her face paled, I tapped my phone. "Already called my lawyer, and the local news loves HOA scandals. Might give them a ring too," watching her sputter as neighbors peeked out, whispering, drawn by the noise. Karen's bravado cracked as the neighbors' whispers grew louder, their heads shaking at the sight of my butchered orchard, and I saw it. The first real flicker of doubt in her eyes, her red face tightening as she realized this wasn't the clean victory she'd imagined. I turned to the foreman, who'd been hovering nervously, and said, "Keep a record of who ordered this. You're about to be dragged into a legal mess, and I doubt she'll take the fall alone." He nodded quick, stepping back from Karen like she was radioactive, and she snapped, "This isn't over." Her voice sharp but shaky, clinging to the last threads of control, but I just smiled, slow and cold. "Oh, I know, but I'm the one who's going to win," and walked back to my house, stepping over broken branches and crushed fruit, the remnants of my life's work. The anger burned hot, but it was sharpening now, focusing into something lethal. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to dismantle her world piece by smug piece, because she hadn't just cut down trees, she'd slashed through my family's legacy, and that was a mistake she'd pay for in ways she couldn't yet fathom. Inside, I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the State Agricultural Department's email, the one confirming my orchard's evaluation for historical preservation, timestamps and all, every tree documented, their lineage traced back decades, their value appraised in the tens of thousands, and I forwarded it to my lawyer with a note. "They destroyed it all, no hearing, no notice, HOA overreach." Then I dug into the HOA handbook, that bloated mess of rules Karen loved to wield, and found Section 5B. Vague as hell, talking visual cohesion, but nothing about unilateral tree removal without due process. She'd twisted it into a weapon, and I'd make sure it backfired. I called my lawyer, a guy who'd chewed up petty tyrants like her before breakfast, and laid it out. The trespassing, the vandalism, the financial hit from lost fruit sales, the cultural loss of heritage trees. And he chuckled. "This is a slam dunk, Joe. We'll bury them in damages and then some." His voice crackling with the kind of glee only a legal shark smells when blood's in the water. By noon, I'd sent him the photos, the state docs, and a list of every fine Karen had slapped me with, each one more proof of her vendetta. I wasn't just suing for the trees. I was suing for the harassment, the power trip, the sheer arrogance of it all. Karen probably thought I'd bluff my way through this, that her precious HOA shield would hold, but she didn't know I'd already lined up my next move. Local news had run HOA horror stories before, and my orchard's destruction was juicier than most, so I dialed a reporter I knew, pitched it short and sweet. "HOA president had my award-winning orchard chainsawed without notice, heritage trees gone, big lawsuit brewing." She bit fast. We'll be there tomorrow, get some shots of the damage. People love a David and Goliath angle. And I could almost hear Corinne's smugness unraveling. She'd waved that paper like a trump card, but I had a full deck, and I was about to play it hard. Back outside, I stared at the stumps, the cherry tree's splintered trunk cutting deepest. My grandfather's pride, now firewood, and I promised myself she'd lose more than she'd taken from me. The next morning, the news crew rolled up right on schedule. A reporter with a sharp bob and a cameraman trailing her, their van's logo gleaming in the sun as they set up near my ruined orchard. I walked them through the wreckage, pointing out the stumps, the crushed fruit, the apple tree's shattered trunk that stood since my birth, my voice steady but thick with the weight of it. These weren't just trees, I told her. They were my family's legacy, state-recognized, award-winning, worth thousands. And the HOA president had them chainsawed without a hearing, no notice, nothing. And she nodded, scribbling fast, her lens catching every jagged scar in the dirt while neighbors hovered, some nodding, others whispering about Corinne's reign. The reporter's eyes lit up when I showed her the state preservation email, the proof my orchard wasn't some backyard hobby but a cultural asset, and she said, "This'll air tonight. People hate HOA overreach, and this is gold," before packing up, leaving me with a quiet thrill. Corinne's smug face was about to hit every TV in town, and she'd have nowhere to hide. I spent the afternoon with my lawyer, nailing down the lawsuit's bones. Property destruction, trespassing, vandalism, financial damages, emotional distress. And when I mentioned the heritage status, he grinned. "That's the kicker, Joe. They didn't just break HOA rules, they broke state law, and we've got 'em cold." Corinne must have seen the news van, because by evening she was packing her porch, phone to her ear, probably scrambling for a defense, but it was too late. The story aired at 6. Local HOA president destroys historic orchard, complete with shots of the carnage and my calm recounting, the reporter's voice cutting. A retired farmer's pride reduced to sawdust by an unchecked homeowners association. Neighbors texted me, saw it unbelievable. And she's done for. While I watched Corinne's blinds snap shut, her house dark like she could block out the storm. I knew she couldn't. The lawsuit was filed that afternoon, served to the HOA and her personally, a fat stack of papers demanding restitution for every tree, every lost harvest, every fine she'd ever pinned on me. My lawyer had tacked on punitive damages, arguing her willful disregard deserved a sting, and the numbers climbed high, 6 figures, maybe more, enough to gut the HOA and leave Corinne's bank account bleeding. She thought I'd roll over, but I was swinging back with everything I had. The neighborhood buzzed the next day, folks stopping by to gawk at the stumps or offer support, some admitting they'd hated Corinne's rules too, but never fought. "You're doing what we couldn't," one said, and I nodded, feeling the weight of it not just for me but for everyone she'd bullied. I kept digging, pulling the HOA meeting minutes my lawyer requested. Shady as hell. A single page claiming a unanimous vote with no details, no notice to me, dated suspiciously after Corinne's last unannounced visit, and I handed it over, another nail for her coffin. By week's end, the HOA board called an emergency meeting, whispers leaking out that they were panicking. Fines were being contested left and right, their power fraying. And I smiled, knowing Corinne's throne was cracking, her visual cohesion excuse crumbling under the spotlight of her own arrogance. The courtroom was a tomb of silence, save for the clock's steady tick, and I sat there, calm as stone, watching Corinne squirm across from me. Her arms crossed so tight they might have snapped, her usual smirk gone, replaced by a pale, pinched look as her eyes darted between her lawyer and the judge. My lawyer laid it out like a surgeon, precise and brutal. Unauthorized destruction of private property, violation of property rights, financial damages, breach of state preservation laws. Each charge a hammer blow, backed by expert appraisals of my orchard's value, lost fruit sales, and the cultural weight of trees under historical review. When he dropped that the cherry tree was from a century-old lineage and the peaches had a market worth in the tens of thousands, Corinne's hands balled into fists. She thought she was just clearing eyesores, not torching a fortune, and now the bill was coming due. I could see her mind spinning, grasping for the control she'd lost the second those chainsaws roared. Her lawyer tried a weak defense. HOA acted for the community's best interest. The orchard was non-compliant. But it was flimsy, the same tired jargon she'd leaned on, and then Karen made her fatal slip, interrupting. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We kept the neighborhood uniform. He was stubborn. We did what needed doing." Her voice sharp with that old arrogance. The judge's gaze lifted, slow and neutral. "Did you say we?" And her lawyer's panicked glance screamed, "Shut up," but she barreled on. "Yes, as HOA president, I have authority to approve these decisions. It was necessary." The room held its breath as he leaned forward. "Did you consult a legal expert before removing the trees?" She hesitated, shook her head. "Provide formal notice to the homeowner." Another shake. "Verify their agricultural or historical significance." Her mouth opened, closed, no answer because she hadn't cared to check. Too drunk on her own power to see the cliff she'd walked off. He sighed, glasses off, rubbing his temples, then ruled. The HOA guilty of overreach and destruction, Karen personally liable as acting president. The damages hit like thunder, enough to cover my losses and cripple the association, her personal share a gut punch that turned her a shade paler than death. By the time court adjourned, she looked sick and I walked past, murmuring, "Hope you didn't have vacation plans, you'll need every penny." Her jaw tight, no reply, just a hollow stare as her world collapsed. The news tore through the neighborhood like a spark in dry grass. Within days, the HOA board met in a frenzy, voting Karen out as president. Some of her loyalists resigning to dodge the fallout, the whole structure teetering as other homeowners challenged old fines, their courage sparked by my win. I didn't stop there. With the payout, I bought the vacant lot next to Karen's house, a spot she'd once lorded over, and hired landscapers to plant a new orchard, bigger, taller rows of trees framing her property, blocking her view. When she saw it, she stormed out, mouth open to yell, but froze as the news crew I'd tipped off rolled up, cameras catching her mid-rage. She retreated, trembling, knowing any scene would seal her public ruin, and I smiled, watching her blinds slam shut, checkmate. The new orchard rose fast, a defiant green wall around Karen's house, each tree a jab at her crumbled empire. Apple, peach, cherry, taller than the old ones, their branches sprawling just enough to choke her view of the neighborhood she'd once ruled. And I'd catch her silhouette behind those drawn blinds, a prisoner of her own making. The landscapers worked with a grin, knowing the story, piling dirt and planting roots while I stood back, hands in my pockets, savoring the slow burn of revenge, not just the trees, but the way they'd bloom into a living monument she couldn't escape. I made sure every detail was perfect, even filing for heritage status again, locking this patch in as untouchable by any future HOA nonsense. A week later, I threw a grand opening bash. Tables groaning with food, music thumping, baskets of free fruit from a friend's farm since mine weren't ripe yet. The whole neighborhood invited except one. And folks streamed in, laughing, eating, their kids darting between the saplings like it was a playground. Karen stayed holed up, her house dark, but I knew she heard it all. The chatter, the joy, the clink of glasses raised to her defeat. And I let it sink in, her isolation louder than any chainsaw she'd unleashed on me. Neighbors shook my hand that night, some sheepish, admitting they'd loathed Karen's iron grip but never pushed back. "You did what we couldn't," one said, biting into an apple, and another chuckled. "Guess you won, huh?" I smiled, watching the sunset gild the new trees. I didn't just win, I made sure she lost, the words tasting sweeter than any harvest. The news crew swung by again, filming the event, their reporter calling it a triumph over HOA tyranny. Shots of smiling faces and fresh-planted rows cutting to old footage of my ruined yard. By morning, it was all over town. Farmer rebuilds after HOA nightmare. And I heard Karen's name hissed in grocery aisles, at gas stations, her reign reduced to a cautionary tale. The HOA itself was imploding. Board members gone, fines unraveling, its power gutted by the lawsuit's fallout and the spotlight I'd turned on their overreach. What was left became a shadow, a casual committee too scared to flex after the beating I'd dealt, and I kept my ear to the ground, ready to stomp any flicker of their old tricks. Karen's house went up for sale a month later. A for sale sign stabbed into her lawn like a surrender flag. She couldn't take it. The orchard looming, the neighbors' newfound freedom, the whispers that followed her every step. And I watched the moving truck roll in, her furniture hauled out, her glare cutting through her window one last time before she vanished. No one missed her. Folks waved as the truck peeled away. Some even toasted it with beers from their porches, and I leaned on my fence, Bessie 2's engine humming nearby, feeling the weight lift off the whole damn street. The orchard thrived, saplings stretching toward the sky, and I'd tend them daily, pruning, watering, letting the rhythm of it settle into my bones. Corinne had tried to bury me, but she'd only fertilized the ground for something bigger, something she'd never outrun. Corinne's exit left a vacuum in Oak Estates, the kind of quiet that follows a storm, and the neighborhood stretched into it, reclaiming itself. Lawns grew shaggy if folks felt like it. Kids chalked sidewalks without a clipboard tyrant barking. And my new orchard stood as a green sentinel, its saplings thickening with each week, roots digging deep into the lot I'd snatched from under her nose. I'd wander the rows at dusk, checking soil, trimming stray branches, the work a steady pulse that kept me grounded. Neighbors started calling it Joe's Revenge. Half laughing, half awed, and I'd nod, letting the name stick because it was more than revenge. It was proof you could fight a bully and win, not just for yourself, but for everyone they'd crushed. The HOA limped along, a gutted shell of its former self. New folks stepped in, cautious types who'd seen the lawsuit's wreckage and swore off the old power trips, turning it into a loose committee that planned picnics instead of fines. And I kept watch, ready to slap down any hint of Corinne's ghost creeping back. The news faded, but the story lingered. People drove by to see the orchard, some snapping photos, others asking about the trees, and I'd tell them, "These are the comeback kids," grinning as their leaves caught the sun, a living middle finger to her chainsaw spree. The payout from the lawsuit sat heavy in my account, more than enough to rebuild, and I poured it into the land. Heritage varieties again, apples and cherries tracing back to my grandfather's stock, peaches that one day rival the old ribbons. I even added a few new twists, plums and pears for the hell of it, turning the lot into a sprawling testament to what she'd tried to erase. My lawyer called one day, chuckling. HOA's still scrambling to pay their share. Corinne's tapped out, sold her car last week. And I pictured her, stripped of her blazer and smugness, haggling over a sedan, the image sharp enough to save her. Her personal liability had hit her like a freight train, and I'd made sure every cent of it stuck. Neighbors dropped by more now, not just to gawk but to talk, swapping stories of Corinne's petty wars. Overgrown shrubs, ugly birdhouses, laughing at how they'd cowered until I'd swung the axe back at her, and one said, "You gave us our yards back, Joe," handing me a beer as the orchard's shadow stretched across what used to be her view. I got a letter from the state ag department midsummer. My new orchard was approved for preservation status, a nod to its lineage and a legal shield no HOA could ever touch again, and I framed it, hung it by the back door where I could see it every time I stepped out to tend the trees. The work felt good, hands in the dirt, the smell of blossoms creeping in, a rhythm that stitched up the hole Corinne's chainsaws had ripped. I wasn't just growing fruit. I was growing something she'd never understand, a legacy tougher than her rules, rooted deeper than her reach. The street stayed quiet now, no more unannounced inspections, just the hum of life settling back into itself. And I'd sit on my porch, watching the saplings sway, knowing I'd turned her attack into my victory. Spring rolled into Oak Estates, and my orchard bloomed fierce, a riot of pink and white blossoms spilling over the lot next to Corinne's old house, now owned by a quiet couple who waved instead of scowling. I'd stand among the trees, pruning shears in hand, watching bees hum through the flowers, the air sweet with promise of fruit to come. The neighborhood had settled into a new skin, free of the HOA's chokehold. Front yards sprouted wildflowers, fences went unpainted if folks felt like it, and kids raced bikes down streets once policed by Corinne's clipboard, her shadow long gone, her name just a sour memory swapped over beers at dusk. The trees thickened, apples and cherries tracing my family's lineage, peaches nodding to those lost ribbons, and I'd added plums and pears, a sprawling patchwork of growth that mocked her visual cohesion with every branch. The state's preservation status locked it all in, a legal fortress, and I'd catch neighbors grinning as they passed, calling it Joe's Triumph, a name I let ride because it fit. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about everyone she'd tried to break. The HOA was a husk now, a casual committee that stuck to potlucks and left the rulebook in the dust. New members knew my story, kept their distance from power plays, and when they asked my input on a community garden, I said, "Plant what you want, just don't touch my trees," earning laughs and a nod of respect. The lawsuit money had rebuilt more than my orchard. It had bought peace, a buffer against the past, and I heard Karen was scraping by somewhere else, her house sale barely covering her debts, her blazer swapped for thrift store threads. My lawyer sent a final update. "She's done, Joe, bankrupt and blacklisted from every HOA in the county." And I toasted that with a glass of whiskey, her downfall a quiet echo to the chainsaws she'd unleashed. Neighbors threw a harvest party that fall. My first apples ripe, tart and red, handed out free with cider-I'd brewed. Folks danced under the trees, music drifting over the lot, and I leaned on a trunk, watching the scene, knowing Karen's empty windows once stared out at this spot, now alive with everything she'd tried to kill. The best revenge wasn't the lawsuit or the payout, though those hit her hard. It was this. Every blossom, every fruit, every laugh that rang out where she'd swung her axe, a living proof she'd lost more than I ever did. I'd walk the rows at dawn, hands brushing leaves, the rhythm of tending them stitching up the old wounds. My grandfather's cherry tree lived again in its sapling kin, my father's apples hung heavy, and the peaches promised ribbons of their own, a legacy she'd fertilized with her own ruin. Oak Estates wasn't hers anymore. It was ours, messy and free, and I'd made damn sure she'd remember that every time she thought of this place. Her attack had only rooted me deeper, turned a chainsaw's roar into a quiet triumph that outlasted her. As the sun dipped, painting the orchard gold, a neighbor raised a glass, "To Joe, who grew us out of her shadow." And I smiled, nodding at the trees, thinking, yeah, I didn't just win. I made something greater, and that's what she'll never outrun.